Fun. You know, you never know what's coming next. So I had not anticipated being here this morning until I got a call a couple of days ago. And Dr. Dean asked if I would sort of fill in for him since he was concerned about, staying in because of the COVID. I'm glad to see that he's feeling well. I talked to him yesterday, and most all the pains and difficulties connected to that are pretty well gone, and he says, I'm just tired and I don't think I should probably get out right now, and I think that's correct. So he asked me if I would fill in. He did call me this morning and fill me in on all the things I should know about what I'm preaching. And so I got all that information down. I said I'd be sure and put a footnote in it somewhere for him. Let's see, here we go. I'm hoping this works like this, and I'll get going here in a second. Please, okay. Okay, well, I'm glad to be here. Get all this stuff to get out. And my wife, Irina, sitting here on the front, down here, wave your hand, okay. And Irina is from Russia, from Siberia, 20 years ago or so. 20 more now, 25 or 4. And so we're living in Texas, which is not the same climate she's familiar with, either from Siberia or Oregon and Washington. So she's getting better weather. So that's the way I look at it. I was born in the Panhandle of Borger, reared in Abilene, taught many years in East Texas, both at LaTourneau University and a number of years at Dallas Seminary. So I've largely been around as a Texan, although I did move away to the socialist states of America, up in the Northwest. And so glad to be back in Texas. And looking at the subject matter of today, what should I talk about? There's never a lacking for something in the Bible. I'll never forget reading a book years ago by W.A. Criswell called Why I Preach That the Bible is Literally True. And he talks about when he was in Louisville, Kentucky, in his doctorate at Southern Seminary, that he went to a local church and was attending, and he was surprised that the pastor up front was speaking out of Shakespeare. I had a similar experience myself with a person, but I'll not go into my story on that. I'll go back to Criswell's. So he went up after the service and he asked him, why are you speaking from Shakespeare and not the Bible? He said, well, I finished the Bible last year, which says a lot about where his theology was. And Criswell recounted that in his book. The point of it is the Bible can never be fully preached. And Criswell tried it several times, chapter by chapter, year after year, for about 40 years at First Baptist Church in Dallas. I had the privilege of him being the graduation speaker when I graduated from Western Seminary in Portland. Interesting man, Criswell. But the fact is he preached chapter by chapter, year after year, and he still didn't cover it all. There's too much. So we'll take one chapter, and when I finish preaching this chapter today, I will have not said all that needs to be said. And that's what you can get from Robbie. So let's talk about putting our worldview into order. Thinking rightly. That's a real need today. People's worldviews in this country and others are skewed, are confused. And we as Christians have a need, not only a need but a duty, to get our thinking straight about several things. We need to think correctly about ourselves, and we need to think correctly about God and others. And Isaiah deals with that somewhat in this passage where he talks about knowing who God is. And the fact is, the first 4 verses tells us something about God. Not all about God. I teach theology. That's what I've been doing largely since I was 24 years old. I've been teaching grad school. It seems like a long time ago. But for all those years, I keep teaching theology. and there's still more to be said. I'm still learning more. Professors don't know it all. They know some things, but they don't know it all because God is expansive. Coming to understand who He is and what He does is difficult to know. And so the fact is, we're going to talk about who God is, and then later on we'll find out who we are and what responsibilities that we have. But notice I say here, there is a significance in the introduction to a book or a talk, how you start out. Sometimes these are long, such as the greatest work of Charles Dickens. I don't know if you've read this. Have you read this or seen the movie on it years ago that was done? A Tale of Two Cities. He starts out, it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, and it was a season of darkness. Spring of hope, and it was a winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct to the other way. This is the days of Dickens, when you didn't use even those words in this context. And he goes on. The point of it is, that's a long introduction, and it says a lot about what the Tale of Two Cities is about, because there are heights and depths in the book. If you read it, there are tragedies and there's courage. You see all the varieties of life in the book. Some is very, very, very terrible, and some is very grand. And that's true with us in our time, don't you think? There are things that we look at and say, that is absolute stupidity, or it is terrible, or whatever you want to say certain things are. And yet, in the midst of it all, there's great things occurring. Life is not just one way or the other. It's lots of things, right? And so that's what we are today. We're in Canada. And so that's A Tale of Two Cities. That introduction says a lot about what the book is about. You know, there are also some short, and these are the way they usually are. If you look at most of the books, and I think about books a lot because I write a lot. And I've got a novel going right now, and I think about these things too. And what words you put before other words and afterwards leads you through a book. I always try to have students to learn this when they're learning how to write, as they're desperately trying to do apparently. Because I read these papers and I want to tear my hair out. Because I think they need to go back to first-year grammar. They don't know how to keep a thought flowing. It's just all erratic and isolated and fragmented. And I'm thinking I'm reading 15 different papers on different subjects. They just go everywhere. And I'm thinking the train of thought needs to follow through. So the fact is that there are some short but grabbing our imagination kinds of beginnings. Here's one. It's not about you. Tim Warren, The Purpose-Driven Life. Tim Warren wrote a book. I think it sold 50 million copies last count that I looked at. I wish I had written that book, but I would have written it differently. Maybe they would have sold 50 million, who knows. But I think that's the best statement in the whole book. You could put the book down and say, you got it. It's not about you. I have a friend who's a pastor of the largest church in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Great guy. Known him for 30 years. And he's a good preacher. And he preaches through the Bible on all sorts of subjects, and he also, passages, and also deals with subjects. And he was up preaching a doctrine of God one day. And somebody came up to him after the service he told me about. And this person said to him, Pastor Scott, he says, your sermon just didn't meet my needs today. And Scott said, what? It just didn't meet me where I am. I mean, your sermon just didn't touch me. And he said, let me explain something to you. This wasn't about you. This was about God. God is worthy of study for himself alone, apart from you, in meeting your needs. And that's where people are. Even in preaching and even in the church, I want to be something that takes care of me. Where maybe we need to learn something about God, not me. And so that's the point. Matter of fact, you know what the Bible's a book about? What's the theme of the Bible? It's not Wayne House. It's not in there. I can't find it anywhere. That's not the theme of the Bible. The theme of the Bible is God. And us then getting to know Him is what our needs are, is becoming like God. Not becoming like ourselves. We're too much like ourselves. We need to be more like God. And so we forget. It's not about you, a great beginning. Here's another one, M. Scott Peck. Book sold millions upon millions of copies, and I wrote a book against it. But that's another story. Life is difficult. First 3 words of the book. M. Scott Peck was invited to I don't know how many evangelical kinds of churches to speak because people are so naive. Oh, that's such a great book. It's so wonderful. I loved it. It changed my life. And I began to read it, and every page I was marking it up for its inaccuracies. It's like Dan Brown's book, the Da Vinci Code. Every page I was marking up. The guy didn't know anything about archaeology, language, history, or anything. But he wrote a book that everybody bought. Maybe I should try that. I don't know. But the fact is, it's not, life is difficult, is true. His solutions were not true because he was more into Buddhism than he was anything. He was clearly a New Ager all the way to Far Eastern religious views, and yet churches were eating it up. There's a lot of stuff going today with some stuff like that where just churches pick up things. Here's another one. Call Me Ishmael. You ever heard of that? First words in Moby Dick. And you wonder, what is all that about? Well, then you read the book and you find out. Here's one in a galaxy far, far away. You ever heard of that? Everybody in here knows those words, right? It was in big screen in a galaxy far, far away. Beginnings of books and even movies are important. It's also true about the Bible. For example, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's a great beginning to a book. And it is. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Sets the stage for John's gospel. And here's one I could have preached a sermon on today. I have one on it that I love, and I've preached it several times. In the days that the judges were judging. What a grand story. Because if you don't know that very fact, if you don't understand what was going on in the days that the judges were judging, you miss the book of Ruth. Because it's in the midst of all of that stuff going on. In the midst of all the debauchery and failures and problems comes this gem in which God is working in the world. Well, the same is true then of our book today. Isaiah, a book written by a very noted Old Testament prophet, one of the greatest for sure. The land of Judah, after the division between the northern and southern kingdom. Isaiah, clearly an educated person of the high rank, very literate. And he starts out this 6th chapter with these words, in the year that King Uzziah died. And we'll find out in a moment who Uzziah is. By the way, Uzziah they have actually found, and it's in my Visual Study Bible, they found a part of a seal that actually has Uzziah's name on it, connecting where his place of burial. And that's in there. I won't go into that archaeological stuff with you today. But the point of it is Uzziah is a real person in the ancient world that should have gone down in history with great note. There's a reason why he should have been remembered as one of the greats of the ancient world, and particularly of the Jewish people in Judah. But notice, in the year that King Uzziah died, why would he say those words? The words have meaning. You put words there because of a reason, unless you're like some of the students I grade. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. We've got a contrast going on here. Because, see, Uzziah occupied the throne of Judah. We're going to find out some things about him in just a moment. See, there are questions here. Who is Uzziah? What is his importance? But who is Yahweh, and what is his importance? Both are matched in the story. The contrast between two kings, one who is high and lifted up, and one who is a great king, should have been, in the land of Judah. So let's look at Uzziah. Listen to the words. This is from 2 Kings. You may or may not know, 2 Kings and 1st and 2 Kings was one book originally in the Hebrew Bible. The people with the Greek Old Testament divided it in two, as they did several. And Chronicles is one book. They divided in two. Some of the chapter and verse divisions, my old Greek professor used to say that the chapter and verse divisions of the Bible were done by a drunk monk on a staggering mule on a dark night. Because somewhere they are all put the wrong places. Those are not divinely inspired folks. I don't know if you know that. But the original manuscripts never had 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3. Those are human inventions that sometimes are not really very accurate. We have to be very careful contextually as we read. But here in 2 Kings it says, in the 27th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Azariah, which is Uzziah, same guy, the son of Amaziah, king of Judah, became king. He was 16 years old when he became king, and he reigned 52 years. I put the dates in there so you would know them. That's not in the Bible, but that's what we're talking about as far as his reign. That's not his life, that's his reign. Can you imagine having a president for 52 years? He'd be sort of the normal guy to think about, right? How many generations came up under him if you had a president? We go for what? 8 years, and Roosevelt went for almost, he went 10 years, I guess it was, because of a third election, then we stopped all of that. 52 years. In Jerusalem, his mother's name was Jeconiah of Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the sight of Yahweh according to all his father Amaziah had done. That sounds good. He did all was right. Excepts are big. He was a really nice person, except. And then you got to find out where's the flaw. And here's this flaw. The high places were not removed. Can anybody tell me what the major problem we had with Solomon was here? Same kind of thing, although he had a number of alliances because, instead of writing contracts in the days of Solomon, who was a king of the north of the entire nation before the split, you had Saul and David and Solomon. Solomon, he made treaties, but when you made a treaty in the ancient world, you took a wife on. Why? Because if you marry the daughter of the king, he's not going to attack you. You're building relationships, and that's how it was done. And even Solomon giving into that, and them having high places of worship. We call that the Mount of Destruction. Sometimes is a term in Israel. It's in the same area, by the way, that the Palestinians live across from the David city. If you were to go there. But the fact is, the people still sacrifice and burn incense on the high places. Then Yahweh struck the king so that he was a leper until the day of his death. So he dwelt in an isolated house. And Jotham, the king's son, was over the royal house, judging the people of the land. That is, you had a stand-in. And we're going to find out what happened that made that so. But before I do that, I want to give accolades to this man. Remember, he did all these things that were right in the sight of God, except. Well, what about him? We find out in the days of Azariah, that his domestic policy and military preparedness was great. I mean, he really built the military up. Strong military. Nobody wanted to attack. He also had good domestic policies that actually helped people to grow their income. By the way, one thing you'll find in the Old and New Testament is you do not find socialism. You find what would be similar to, not exactly, but similar to what we call capitalism. And it was leading toward that kind of economic framework. And so what you find here, that his domestic policies, his military policies, great. Political and economic concerns relative to his southern and eastern borders. That is, he built up the eastern and the southern borders. Why is that? Because you've got Egypt below, and you've got all these other cities that come from like Babylon and what we think of as, which is Iraq today, and Iran, what we think of as Persia in the ancient days. We have all these places over here. He's building up the borders so everything is secure. You could feel comfortable living in that land. The settling of the perennial Philistine problem was dealt with. Who's tried to solve the Philistine problem? Several people. Now, by the way, I got a kick out of listening to Arafat years ago. You know who Arafat was, the so-called Palestinian leader? Where he talked about, as he tried to have an argument why the Palestinians should have right to the land, he said, well, we're descendants of the Philistines. We're the Philistines. We're the ancient Philistines. Except the Philistines were Greeks. And I think all the Arabs are not connected to the Greek world. So he had his history and geography and ethnology wrong. But nonetheless, the Philistine problem was there, and Samson was supposed to be the hero, and he fell through bad like. We can't really say with Samson, he was right in the eyes of the Lord, except it's almost like he was a little bit following God, but usually not. The same, there's a little bit different view. Samson didn't do it. David tried to do it and was fairly successful, but it was never really solved until the days of Uzziah. And then it was solved, finally. He reigned for 52 years and had a prosperity not seen since the days of Solomon 2 centuries earlier. I mean, this guy was good. 50 years of leading well. I mean, generally speaking, did a great job. 2 donkeys in every garage. You know, everybody had what they needed. All the Social Security was up. I mean, everything was great in the country with this man. He did great. But he also had a problem. Not only did he allow people to still sacrifice on the mountains, which was, so what's the problem with that? Maybe they were sacrificing to Yahweh, God, on the mountain. No, see, where were you supposed to worship? See, on the Temple Mount, right? And so what he did, he went and he had a strong heart, it said, to his destruction, for he transgressed against Yahweh his God by entering the temple of Yahweh to burn incense on the altar of incense. He wasn't on the high places, he was in the temple as the king. So Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him were 80 priests of Yahweh, valiant men. And they withstood King Uzziah and said to him, it is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to Yahweh, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have trespassed. Sometimes people, what's the Lord, was it Edmund Burke? I'm trying to think who said this. But he said, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there's a sense as you amass to yourselves power and prestige, wealth, all those kinds of things, you begin to think yourself somewhat like a god. Totally self-sufficient. Nobody can touch you. You can do what you want. And so the priest, they say, get out of here, you're trespassing. Even the king doesn't have a right to come in here. Then Uzziah became furious. He should have left. At that point, he might have made it. They said, "Get out of here." And he says, "Ooh, wrong place, wrong time," and left. But he said, "Hey, who do you think you are? I'm the king." He became furious. And he had a censer in his hand to burn incense, and while he was angry with the priest, leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priest in the house of Yahweh, before the incense altar. And Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked at him, and there on his forehead that he was leprous. They thrust him out of that place. Indeed, he also hurried to get out. Quite a depiction here, because Yahweh had struck him. Even he said, "Oops, I went too far." King Uzziah was a leper until the day of his death. We don't know exactly how long that was. We do know he then, I don't know how long the leprosy was, but apparently he was the king during those years I gave you. If he was cut off from the house of Yahweh, then Jotham his son was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. Well, here you have then Uzziah being a great man, but not knowing where he belonged, not knowing how he should act, and certainly not knowing God as a holy God. He missed it in spite of all his good things. So Isaiah, when he talks about this, he says, you've got to understand, in the year that King Uzziah died is a year that I had a vision. And this is a vision he writes. And it's a vision that separates Uzziah as king of Judah from Yahweh, king of the universe. For all that Uzziah did that was correct, he still did not have a proper understanding of God. And that can be true of us. We can go to church and do all the churchy things. Is that a word? All these things that relate to being a Christian at church and going through our lives, and we may be missing something in our understanding of God. That's not uncommon. I think that's one reason why I've been working on some things, and it's amazing where churches are going with their ideas of worship and preaching and all these things today. They've lost it. So many churches have just lost it, and I haven't got time to talk about all of that. But you can have, Christian background, you can have Christian training, you can do all these things and not think Christianly and godly. But Isaiah says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple, not just in the Shekinah glory, not just in the holiest of holies, but it filled the temple. And above it stood the seraphim, which is the plural. Each one had 6 wings, with 2 covering their face, their feet, and and flying. So one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. So the contrast that we began to see between Uzziah, and I took some time to develop that, because usually we just see the words, and we don't understand the background that's in the thoughts of the writer. Isaiah knew exactly who Uzziah was, and they knew a part of the problem. He died a year that God gave a vision of himself. And see, we begin to have confidence in people that we view as great or powerful or wealthy or interesting or whatever the factors may be about a person. Sometimes we become enamored, or we begin to be followers, of them, not realizing the fact that our focus needs to be different. And that's what Isaiah is saying. He says, I saw a vision of God. And I found out something else that I didn't know. And he looked at the seraphim, that's more than one, these seraphim, and he said, they're saying something. They're saying, holy, holy, holy. Now, the word holy in Hebrew is an interesting word. And we tend to think of holy as being separate morally in regards to something. Dr. Dean and I were talking this morning a few moments, and we were discussing this. And he said, well, you know what holy means? I said, well, it means not going to movies and to bowling alleys. Because when I was growing up in a holiness Pentecostal church, we had a rule, these advice to members. You know, we had 29 teachings of all the things of the Bible, most of which were irrelevant to the whole issue. Some of the major teachings we should have had, we didn't list. We just had some trivial ones that we shouldn't have had there to begin with. But then we had an advice to members, which is addition that you're supposed to follow if you really want to live a sanctified life. And some of these are not going to certain kinds of events, you know, and the state overseer one time was in our house, and we were talking, and I asked him about a bowling alley. He said, well, you can't go to bowling alleys. And I said, why can't I go to a bowling alley? He said, because they serve beer there. And I said, but Abilene, Texas, is a dry county. They don't have beer. He said, you can't go anyway. That was his response to me. I can never forget it. I thought, where's the reasoning to all this? By the way, those kinds of questions coming back to me began to make me think about things that if they're so stupid in this area, who knows what else is wrong. So actually it was a good move on his part to help me out. So the fact is that holy in Hebrew does not relate pure to morality as we think of it. And it refers to something quite different. It's the idea of being different and separate and distinct. Otherness. Being different from others. And that's why when God said, you are to be holy because I am holy. And he's not talking about rules that we might put on a wall. He's thinking about how you are as a person, how you relate to others. Remember that part of them being holy, the Israelites were required to wear certain kinds of clothes, different kinds of weaving, different kinds of activity about how they did daily activities, and on and on and on. God kept trying to impress to them that you have people around you that go one way, but you're to be other than them. You're not to be like them. You're not to frame your life after them. This is something we haven't fully understood sometimes. We don't need to be like certain people. We need to be like God. You understand? We've been called to be different. Holy. Not referring to whether you drink or don't drink or whether you do this or don't do that. It's reference to how can you be like God rather than like those who are not like God. And that recovers a lot of areas on how you deal with things and people and events. Like Uzziah, he could have learned that lesson quite easily. You know, he thought that he had a right to do what he wanted. But the fact is, holy, holy, holy here has sometimes been used by people to refer to the Trinity. And I love the song. I really do. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. You know, that's a great, great song. I used to sing it a lot. But I don't think that they're really trying to teach the doctrine of the Trinity here. There's something about, maybe it's implicit. I don't know. But there's something about the word and how it's used in Hebrew. When in Hebrew you want to say something is very good, you would say like good, good. If you want to say it's extraordinarily or indescribably good, you'd say good, good, good. You'd list it 3 times. That was rarely done. You're saying it's a way they had to emphasize something. We have adverbs, very, very good, very holy. We have words we've invented that cover those things. But in Hebrew, they did it by multiplication of the same word. So when you see him saying Chadosh, 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 he's saying Yahweh is not only different and other. He's not just simply very different, but he can't be described as how different he is. He is extremely, extraordinarily holy. He is the Holy One of the hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Notice, he just got through saying that the temple was full of his glory. But now he says the whole earth is full of his glory. That is, God is not restricted to a temple made by men's hands. That was actually said by the Apostle Paul, but you know who said it before? Solomon, when he dedicated this multi-billion-dollar structure in today's dollars, when you see the things he had there, when he developed this unbelievable structure for Yahweh on the Temple Mount, and he gets up and says his prayer for having accomplished what his father David was not allowed to do. And man, you'd say, man, this is great. Didn't I do a great job? I mean, I designed this thing myself. You know, I was the one, you know, look at me. That wasn't Solomon's attitude at that point at all. Solomon said, Lord, he says, I know that this temple that I've made cannot contain you. For heaven is your throne, earth is your footstool. He said, you cannot be contained by such things. You are everywhere. Heaven is your throne, earth is your footstool. He says, but God, in spite of that, when we pray toward this temple, hear our prayer. We need to sort of learn something about that. We can't visualize omniscience. We cannot visualize omnipresence. I teach theology, and it's hard for me to explain that. What does it mean for God to be everywhere and not something of some others? Is God here? Well, he's not this piece of wood, but he's everywhere. What does that mean? I try to explain it sometimes that when we say God is everywhere, you have God before creation was all there was. And then he brought into existence all that was not him. You understand? That's what creation is. Creation is God bringing into existence everything that is not him, because he already pre-existed, right? So he created this universe, everything that was not him. So you have two realities now, God and that which is not God. That's it. And I'm saying what it is for God to be omnipresent is everywhere there is something, there is God. There's no place that he is not. That's why, David, if I make my place in Sheol, you're there. If I make my place in the heavens, you're there. I can't escape from your presence. And Solomon sort of had that idea here. He says, you know, I realize that I can't confine you to the Holy of Holies. Remember, that's where God dwelt between the cherubim above the mercy seat. You know, they had a little place they had a big draping so that only the one priest, you know, once in a lifetime could go into the Holy of Holies and be where God is. Well, see, people think we have God in a box. No. That's a place for focus. But that is not where God is. God is there and everywhere else. There is not something other than God. He's everywhere. Does that make sense to you? And so that's what we're dealing here. It says the whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. Now, let's talk about the importance of this. We have to know who God is, but we also have to know who we are. A lot of people sort of think themselves to be God. That is, they are in control of everything in their life. And we find out eventually that we're in very little control of our life. We actually are in dependence upon God. So we need to know who we are. So Isaiah, when he saw this great vision of God, the Holy One, the very Holy One, the indescribably Holy One, he thought, ooh, oy vey. Oy vey. Hineni. I'm in for it. I got problems. By the way, Uzziah should have done that. He should have, oh boy, I really goofed up on this one. I'm out of here. And he may have stayed king in the throne as he was. but he got mad. Isaiah's response is different. Isaiah looked at this and says, wow, oy vey, woe is me. I am undone because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, Yahweh of hosts. The fact is, he saw himself in contrast to who really is. It's not about me. See, I'm not the focus point of the universe. I'm not the one who has all the answers. In fact, my eyes have seen the eyes of God. And so that puts it in a different perspective for him. Now, when he does this personal reflection on God, the seraphim come to him. And then they do something that is very New Testament-like. And the reason I say that is because they came to him with a live coal taken from the tongs of the altar, touched his mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips, your iniquity is taken away, your sin is purged. Now, why was Isaiah's sin purged by the seraphim, I have to ask? Why did they go to this act? Why did they do this thing? It's because he's been looking at God, he's recognized that he's not God, and he's recognized that is he in trouble because he is not truly like God. God stands apart. And Isaiah says, I'm in trouble because I've actually beheld purity in its nth degree, holiness in its nth degree, otherness. These are things that I am not. I have a different view of God and myself. With that then comes forgiveness. And that's really what a lot of forgiveness is about. You know that? Confession, that word, two Latin words, confession means to basically to speak the same thing, to speak together, to agree. God says, what about me? Anybody know? We had a little thing this morning. God says, you're a sinner. And I said, boy, you're right. I mean, I am really one. In other words, it's not an attempt to try to vindicate ourselves. It's a recognition that I agree with what God says. God says, what about himself? I am holy. Then how do I become holy? It doesn't come by human effort. Do you realize that? You can never be holy simply by human effort. You can never be holy by trying to be a better Christian in that respect. You come by recognizing that you're not God and you need his help to do it. You cannot have self-sufficiency. You cannot have this arrogance, this self-sufficiency like Uzziah had and Isaiah didn't have, because he looked and said, you know, I really understand God now. He's more than I can say or speak. He's indescribably holy. And then the angels say, based on that confession, that you recognize that you're a sinner and God is not. God, you're the one who is needing someone, and God doesn't need you. By the way, that's what Paul says in Romans chapter 9. He says God doesn't need anybody. Who does God ask for information? Who does God ask for advice? I've always thought about the fact that why would God listen to me getting wisdom from me? You know, I'm going to instruct God on what is right or wrong. Really? Who makes us that way? That we think we have the word. I just need to get in tune with God, not in tune with my own thoughts. He says, but this has touched your lips, your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is purged. So what we have here as we move through this is the fact that once he recognized that he was a sinner, then the angel was able to do something with him. When you have finally broken down, confessed, and recognized that you are not in control, you're not in charge, you're not in control of your life, that is the very point that God can use you. Not really before. It's only when you've gotten to this point, because they The voice of the Lord said, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here am I, send me. So that's why I'm saying knowing our mission is only in view of finally our forgiveness, is our recognition of who God is and what our limitations are. People only who are broken down are the ones that can be used to be put back together again rightly. And I think that's what we're finding here in the text. God desires to communicate with people. But I want to show you something here. It's sort of odd that in the midst of this passage, I was expecting this passage to read differently and go another way. We have, Uzziah shown for who he is. God now is revealed. Isaiah understands who God is, and now he says, I recognize I'm a sinner. And now, God has forgiven me, and now I have a mission. I'm going to go preach the gospel, and all these people will become saved. That's what I'm expecting. This is where I'm following through, and this is what I think. This is where it's going to go. We're going to have a Jonah and Nineveh here, right? But it's not. The text takes a twist and a turn differently than I anticipated. The fact is, judgment oftentimes precedes redemption. Now, this is something we have to think about, and I'm not going to get into all these discussions of recent days, and I have my own views on that, which are probably not far from most of you. But the fact is that sometimes even people that are believers find themselves in the midst of situations where other people bring judgment from God. And because of that, we become part of the process. And I don't like that idea. But nonetheless, notice, he says, go to this people. What people? The people of Judah. And tell them something that they're not going to receive. They're not going to accept. They're going to say, you made it up. You didn't have a vision. You don't have information. You are not, you're not correct. The fact is, he goes and says, go and tell this people. Keep on hearing, don't understand. Keep on seeing, do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull, their ears heavy. Shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and return and be healed. In other words, God says, I'm really thinking more of judgment now instead of redemption. Sometimes you go too far, and God has to deal with it. I'm sure, we can think of the people in the flood. Why didn't God say one more time? Or the people in Sodom and Gomorrah, why didn't God give one more opportunity? It's always one more. And God says, I'm sort of tired of this. No. Matter of fact, remember with the Canaanites, God had said in Genesis 15, he said, your people are going to go into Egypt for 400 years and come out because the evilness, the debauchery of the Canaanites has not yet got full yet. And then I'm going to bring judgment. It wasn't redemption, but judgment. So that sometimes happens here. And this passage is one mentioned by Jesus when he's talking. Why did you talk to the people in parables? And you talk to us plainly. In other words, Jesus talked to the disciples with the parables too. They heard the same thing, but then he went privately and explained them. He said, why don't you talk to the people that way? Jesus quotes here. Hearing they'll not hear. Seeing they'll not see. Lest they be saved. So God sometimes, he says, I am holy, and because of that, there has to be judgment. Having said that, though, we come to the end of the text. Here's the beauty of it all. God does bring judgment. We don't know what God's going to do in our world today. God does bring judgment. But always and forever, and I could go back to biblical passages to show this to you, always and forever, God, even though he brings judgment for a time. He said at one time, he says, my anger, lasts but for a moment, but my grace is forever. In other words, yes, I have anger to deal with an issue, but there's amazing grace, if I can use that that God has. For notice the last statement in verse 13. And yet a tenth, see, Yahweh has removed men far away, the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land, but yet a tenth will be in it. You know, tenth like a tithe is a representation. A tenth will be in it and will return and be for consuming, and a terebinth tree or an oak whose stump remains when it is cut down, so the holy seed shall be its stump. That's somewhat obscure, except that I think what it's saying is that even though I'm going to bring judgment on the land, and he does, doesn't he? Even at this time we're talking about the 8th century with Isaiah. What happens eventually? 587, 86. Nebuchadnezzar. Judah is never carried off. But in the midst of all the judgment that's coming, he said there is a tenth, there is a remnant, there is a portion that will still receive my grace. And that's exactly what happened as God turned back after the time of what we think of as Hezekiah, the Babylonian captivity, and the return from captivity that we know in other passages of Scripture. But I think this is actually referring to that God's mercy extends beyond his judgment. And so in this passage, I think we learn some things. That God is not a God to be played with. He is a God who is holy, indescribably holy, above human concerns, and he's not a God that we take for granted, so to speak. He's not a God that we begin to give our own perspectives rather than his. We don't try to build ourselves. We actually find ourselves in him being built. And that goes back to the sermon I mentioned by my friend Scott. When the person says, you know, you're not meeting my needs. Let me tell you something. Come to know more about God and your needs will be met. See, they had it wrong. You know, I want you to talk about some specific in my life to be dealt with when if you're learning more about God, that specific will be dealt with. That's the point. That's what Isaiah learned, and that's what hopefully we can learn here today. Let's see, I made a mistake here. Hold on just a second. Computers, there we are. Robbie said I could put that up. If you want to get some more information, you can look at that, but I'll just leave that up. But what I want to do is end in prayer, and then I think we'll be having Alan Westfall who will be doing a closing hymn. Lord, we're thankful for all your blessings to us and what we've seen in Isaiah today, which is only a portion of what is in the passage. But we can see that you truly are beyond us and that we need to rely upon you instead of ourselves. Our tendency is to try to rely on ourselves for everything. And yet, Lord, we know that without you, we can, in fact, do nothing. So enlighten our heart and our mind to understanding. Help us to have a vision of you, that we see ourselves for who we really are and see you for who you really are, so that we might grow and be what you want us to be. Forgive us, Lord, when we fail. Lead us, Lord, into the righteous paths. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Wayne. Appreciate you coming and filling in, and appreciate your special message today. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and close on that, and we'll have, Robbie said Thursday night will be live and open to all to come in person, so just keep that in mind. All right, we'll close in prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this message that you received today. Thank you for the opportunity for Dr. House to come and bring us his message. We thank you for all you do for this church, and we thank you for the word that you provide for us on a regular basis. We ask that those will be traveling at home this afternoon will be safe and be able to return at our next session. We thank you for all these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen.